Esbon, John Wampus, Sylvanus Waddle, an Indian boy of the Holbrooks, an Indian girl of Mr. Dudley, Mariah, Peter, Thomas Beduna, Elizabeth Beduna,
Benjamin Beduna, Joseph Beduna, Abigail Beduna, Lydia Beduna, Ebenezer Beduna, Moses Beduna, Joachim, also known as Cuffy, Amos Hill, Simon Gosson, James Trusty.
Dan, Anthony, Brill, Jimmy, quote, a likely Negro woman, Flora, Sabby, Boston Jr., Caesar, Peter,
Dina, Jeffrey, Bristol, Elizabeth, Simon, Tobias, a Negro male child, mother of a Negro male child, Ishmael, Venus, Richard, a Negro girl about 17 years of age, Roxbury, Phyllis, Bristow, Cato, London, Phyllis, Prince, Phyllis, Cuffy, unknown, a Negro man, unknown, Juba, Cuffy, Boston, Boston.
Flora, Phyllis, Phyllis's child, quote, a Negro man, Sharper, Fortune, Guinea, Jonathan, Dinah.
These are the names of human beings, Black and Indigenous men, women, and children who were enslaved by First Church Roxbury's white parishioners.
Welcome to Race and Slavery at First Church in Roxbury. This is the final event in the Partnership of Historic Boston's fall series, Enslavement and Resistance, New England, 1620 to 1760. I'd like to welcome you here in the Putnam Chapel at First Church Roxbury, and I'd like to welcome everyone on the Zoom audience to this final event. I'm Roxanne Reddington-Wild, and I'm moderating for this evening for the Partnership of Historic Bostons. I'd like to very much thank Mass Humanities for the grant that they gave the partnership, PHB, in order that we can do these hybrid joint live and on Zoom events. And I very much want to thank the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministries, who said, hey, come and let's do this final event here at First Church in Roxbury. And I'd like to thank the marvelous audiences turned out everywhere. Tonight, we will hear more about those who were enslaved here by parishioners of the church in the 17th and early 18th century. The Partnership of Historic Bostons, note the plural, specializes in the public history of Boston, of Massachusetts, of New England, and that plural Bostons, also Boston and the area around Boston in England as a 17th century place. We'd like to welcome you. And now I would like to welcome Reverend Mary Margaret Earl, who is the head of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministries, who will tell us how this all came about.
Thank you and welcome here this evening. I'm Mary Margaret Earl. I'm the Executive Director and Senior Minister here at the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry, which is so proud to be part of the evening tonight that's sponsored by Historic Bostons. And I especially want to thank Roxanne Reddington for all her work pulling this together. Thank you. And we're very proud to partner with the Roxbury Historical Society in an effort to make visible in our meeting house and in our work the history of enslavement at First Church Roxbury, a campus and meeting house that we, the urban ministry, inherited in 1976 and which we now inhabit. In 2020, after the killing of George Floyd, the urban ministry made a statement called We Speak Now, which included specific actions that we wanted to make that we continue to hold ourselves accountable for. One of these was a commitment to interrogating the racial history of the meeting house, known as First Church Roxbury, and investigating ways that the congregation of First Church Roxbury and the urban ministry through time has served and failed to serve people of color. And we are committed to telling these stories. This evening's presentation is another step in that commitment. We have been honored to work with Aabid Allibhai, a graduate student at Harvard's African American Studies program, who did extraordinary research into this history and completed the report that we draw from this evening, and he'll be introduced in a moment. And I'm very proud now to introduce Roxbury Historical Society board member Byron Rushing, who in his long public life has exemplified learning, leaning into history to advance justice, and who has taught me personally so much about how to see the arc of history as a way of facing the present. There is so much I could say to introduce Byron, but I will summarize it this way. Byron's whole life has been in service of justice and truth, and he is a truth teller. He is a change maker. He is a leader. He is a scholar and an historian, and it's an honor to accompany him on this journey, and I'm proud to introduce him, Byron Rushing.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming out on this cold evening. But we won't disparage all the people on Zoom who wanted to stay warm. We are here because of the extraordinary work and research of Aabid Allibhai. He is a graduate student at Harvard. He was last year the Dorothy Porter and Charles Wesley Fellow in the W.B. Du Bois Research Institute. I always have to stick this in, and I knew both Dorothy and Charles when they were alive. And he is a PhD candidate in African American Studies and has now been awarded a fellowship in the study of the Republic, American Republic at Harvard. We first met while he was researching Africans on the Shirley Eustace estate in Roxbury, this 18th century colonial Massachusetts governor's mansion that is now owned and interpreted by the Shirley Eustace House Association. This work was done as the association was preparing an application for Boston landmark status, and we can talk about this afterwards during questions, has discovered a contemporary building that is now across the street that was built as the barn and probably was the site of the of where certainly the male enslaved people on that lived on the Shirley Eustace estate. Seeing his work there, were able to convince, as you heard, First Church Roxbury to take the same kind of deep look into the records of this church, which of course is founded by the Puritans in 1630. They had a history that was written in the late 19th century. And in that history, they noted 14 Negroes in its index that had some relationship, usually baptism, to the church. Aabid was not working very long, though intensely, before he found almost 80 African and indigenous human beings with connections to First Church and its members. And of that number, at least 58 were enslaved at the time that that relationship existed. There are many things that you will hear from Aabid, but I have to tell you that I was not really surprised knowing his intelligence and ability of all he found. But I will say this, I was surprised by a poem that he actually introduced me to, which he used as the preface for this study. And that was by Lucille Clifton, and you see it behind me. Lucille Clifton was the poet laureate of Maryland's, the state of Maryland, and she was asked to write a poem to celebrate Maryland's 350th anniversary. Unfortunately, she is not around because we'd be hiring her right now to do the funny one that we're going to be celebrating in a few years. It's an amazing poem, but listen to it as well as read it. Why people be mad at me sometimes. They ask me to remember, and they want me to remember their memories. And I keep on remembering mine. Aabid.
Thank you, Byron, for the generous introduction, and thank you to all the folks at the UU Urban Ministry and at Historic Boston's for organizing the event, and for all of you for attending. What I'd like to do today is to provide a series of snapshots about the lives of enslaved people at the First Church in Roxbury, which we should note was founded on Massachusetts land. All right, so let's get right into it. As you can see behind me, people of color, unlike white people, appeared in First Church records alongside a notation of their race. This practice, which reinforced the otherness of Black and Indigenous people and their Christianity, was universal among churches in colonial New England. For instance, when Nan, enslaved by First Church's inaugural pastor Thomas Weld, passed away in 1646, the church simply noted that, quote, Nan, Mr. Weld's captive Indian, died, who was also hopeful. When an enslaved Black woman named Guinea was baptized, the church described her as, quote, Guinea Negro servant maid to Judge Dudley. At the First Church in Roxbury, there was one exception to the practice of recording the race of non-white people, the Bedunia family, whom the historian Gloria Whiting has written about at length. Thomas Bedunia was a free Black man who married and raised a family with a white woman named Lydia Craft in 1703. As marriages could be performed by either pastors or justices of the peace, the couple had multiple options in their hometown of Roxbury. They could approach First Church pastor Walter or one of the local judges of the peace, Paul Dudley or James Bailey. Instead, in what had been a cold, snowy October, they trudged to Boston, deciding to perform their nuptials at the residence of Justice of the Peace Samuel Sewall. Sewall had previously wed enslaved Black couples, and perhaps this was why Thomas and Lydia strategically chose to approach him instead of his Roxbury counterparts. While Black and white people had long engaged in sexual and romantic relationships, Thomas and Lydia appear to be the first interracial couple in Massachusetts to request a formal marriage. In 1703, no legal prohibition existed against interracial marriage in Massachusetts, though 2 years after the Bedunias' marriage, the colonial legislature passed, quote, an act for the better preventing of a spurious and mixed issue. The law banned interracial marriages and added severe punishments for interracial fornication while securing the right of enslaved people to marry each other, though enslavers didn't necessarily respect this right. As their marriage was the only recorded interracial marriage in the colony before the law was passed, it is quite probable that colonial authorities enacted the law, at least in part in response to Thomas and Lydia's union. Thomas Bedunia was likely born in West Africa, stolen from his home and family, and survived the treacherous Middle Passage to the Americas before somehow managing to regain his freedom. One can surmise his origins from his name. No white colonist in Massachusetts was named Bedunia, and Badu was an Akan name sometimes given to the 10th born son of a family. As Gloria Whiting notes, Bedunia has a strong phonetic progenitor in a common West African given name, Badu or Bedua. The Akan are from present-day Ghana, what Europeans called the Gold Coast after its major export. By the turn of the 18th century, however, enslaved people overtook gold as the region's major export, though the neighboring region, present-day Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, was already called the Slave Coast for its major export. Thomas and Lydia Bedunia had 7 children together, some of whom were baptized at the First Church of Roxbury. First Church chose not to document the races of Thomas and Lydia's children who, like their father, would go on to marry white partners. At least one of the Bedunia children, Benjamin, rests in Roxbury's Elliott burial ground. His gravestone reads, in memory of Benjamin Bedunia, who died the 25th day of August, 1771. The resting places of the other Bedunias and those of most Black people who died in colonial New England remain unknown. The graves of most colonial era Black people, especially those who were enslaved, are unmarked. Some had gravestones that are now lost. However, historian Caitlin Hopkins notes that most of New England's colonial era graveyards holds the bones of the enslaved, as most New England burying places segregated Black and white graves within a shared boundary. Surely then, many other people of African descent rest in the Elliott burial ground. The First Church of Roxbury, like all predominantly white churches in colonial New England, was interracial but segregated. Whites relegated people of color to the balconies or the back of the main floor of the church. On August 31st, 1741, First Church parishioners, quote, proposed whether the westerly corner of the meeting house should be a place provided for ye Negroes to sit in, so as not to intrude on ye pews in the said west galleries. The vote passed in the affirmative. 6 decades later, in its directions for building the present meeting house in 1804 behind us, the First Church congregation specified that, quote, there will be seats for the people of color above and back of the singer's seats so as to occupy part of the tower. So this is the present meeting house behind me, built in 1804. This is the first floor. It was white only. And this is the second floor of the meeting house, and I've shaded the part in red where Black people and Indigenous people were relegated to. As you can see, it's farthest back, second floor behind the singers. But even if racial segregation was not codified in writing, it was nevertheless the prevailing custom in New England churches, as was the case at NIMS Church in Litchfield, Connecticut. One Sunday morning in 1764, 3 white youths arrived early at the Litchfield Church to find Nim, a Black man enslaved by one Colonel Ebenezer Marsh, sitting in a pew favored by one of the boys. Nim had been making a practice of sitting in this particular pew to the great annoyance of white church members. The boy could have sat with Nim in the pew's empty seats, but sharing a pew with a Black man was unacceptable to him and other white congregants. Unlike the First Church of Roxbury, the Litchfield Church apparently never held a formal vote on racial segregation. However, several white members complained that Nim was violating a long-standing custom of racial segregation. Accordingly, some white congregants found Nim's conduct to be, quote, indecent and unbecoming, and protested that it was, quote, very insolent for Black people and slaves to sit in any pews that are by custom and usage appropriated to the use of white people. Several church members complained to Nim's enslaver, Colonel Marsh, and installed some sort of iron instrument on the pew's door to lock it shut. Nim, however, tore off the device and declared with horrid oaths that he would, quote, stew the said pew with the guts and bowels of those who should dare to oppose his sitting there. I sometimes like to think of this as one of the first, or among the first sit-ins in what became the United States. So Nim persisted in sitting where he wished, and a few Sundays later, the 3 youths arrived at the Litchfield Church early to stop him, but Nim was already there peacefully sitting in his pew. The boys entered the pew and forcefully threw him out. Some church members defended the boys' violence, though others were appalled by what they called rude, profane, and unlawful behavior in a church. Therefore, 2 months later, the youths were taken to court to account for their assaults, but unsurprisingly, the case was resolved in their favor. And I wish we knew more about Nim's life. Enslaved people's Christian practice could be further undermined because of their enslaved status in particular. While, as we have seen, records about the inner lives of enslaved people at First Church are exceedingly sparse, Keturah's experience shines some light on such obstruction of Christian practice. In 1756, Keturah, a Black woman enslaved by First Church member Thomas Seaver, quote, desired to give herself up to God in baptism. Seaver didn't object. Still, Keturah faced difficulty because her husband's enslaver, in violation of Massachusetts law, forbade them from marrying. Keturah and her husband thus lived together as if they were husband and wife for 12 years and birthed at least 2 children. Phoebe and Susanna, both enslaved by Seaver. They were technically living together without being formally married, which was in contravention of church principles. But Keturah argued her case well, providing First Church with a precedent for someone in her situation who was baptized at another church. Keturah's argument, unfortunately her exact words were not recorded, managed to convince the congregation to reverse their decision. On September 12, 1756, Keturah and her 2 daughters were baptized at the First Church of Roxbury. But enslaved people at the First Church of Roxbury resisted in a number of ways, as Maria's case demonstrates. After attending a nighttime revel hosted by a white church member named Sarah Cleaves, an enslaved Black woman named Maria used hot coal to set ablaze the homes of 2 First Church members, Dr. Thomas Swan and her enslaver, Joshua Lamb. One girl, the church scribe recorded, quote, was burned and all the rest had much ado to escape with their lives. Maria pleaded guilty and was sentenced to be burned to death by the governor of Massachusetts. On September 22nd, 1681, Maria was executed at the gallows in Boston Neck along with 2 men, a white man for rape and a Black man for burning a house in Northampton. Unlike Maria, however, the men were sentenced to be hanged. At the gallows, Cotton Mather described a scene of death and, quote, a picture of hell too, at the sight of Maria being burnt at the stake. So right here, you can see where the gallows were in Boston, at the Boston Neck, sometimes called the Roxbury Neck. I've been to the spot and there's no marker for Maria, and I hope there is one someday. So in her confession, Maria implicated 2 other enslaved people in the fires. Shephelia, a Black man enslaved by one Mr. Walker of Boston, and Cuffy, a Black man enslaved by one James Pemberton. The grand jury, however, did not find sufficient evidence to indict them. Nevertheless, fearful of slave rebellion and with little regard for justice or Black lives, the court ordered that Shephelia and Cuffy be sold out of New England. Historian Kaylee Nicole Gross provides crucial context to Maria's story. While popular memory about women burned at the stake conjures images of 17th century white women burned to death for witchcraft, in fact, these women and girls were hanged. Women were indeed burned at the stake during this period. However, most of them were not white, but Black. Maria was the first woman to be burned at the stake in the 13 mainland colonies, and one of 2 women in colonial Massachusetts, both of whom were enslaved Black women. Beginning with Maria's death and ending with the last known woman burned at the stake, a Black woman in North Carolina in 1805, the overwhelming majority, 87%, were Black. Black women convicted of arson or murder faced harsher punishments than their white counterparts. And as Gross explains, Maria's case highlights other ominous legacies. Throughout much of the nation's history, Black women constituted the lion's share of female death penalty cases, especially during and after the Civil War. Maria's case is little known, and there is so much about her we do not know. Where was she from? Did she have a family? How old was she? Why did she set her enslaver's house on fire? In this way, Gross explains, Maria's story is an apt metaphor for the treatment of Black women in the historical record, illuminating a dynamic as tragic as it is timeless. Back then, white people didn't bother to document the lives of Black women. Today, as evidenced by aggressive efforts to restrict the teaching of the United States' racial history, many white people want even the limited remnants buried. Gross continues, if we are to effectively work toward equal justice in this country, we must know this history and understand its impact on Black women's lives. In the present, we cannot allow for racist tyranny to silence the past. These testimonies exist and we must hear them. The enslaved at the First Church of Roxbury were separated from their families, often several times throughout their lives, like all enslaved people in New England. In addition to buying and selling human beings, some First Church enslavers tore apart families by giving away Black babies and little children. First Church member John Greeton, for instance, advertised, quote, a Negro male child of an excellent breed to be given away. An announcement a short time later was presumably Greeton again marketing the same child, quote, to be given away, a likely Negro male child born and still at Roxbury. Breton's actions were not uncommon. Indeed, enslaved children in and around Boston were often given away by enslavers. To give just a few of countless gruesome examples from colonial Boston newspapers. Quote, a very likely female Negro child to be given away. Another, quote, a Negro child a few days old to be given away. As Massachusetts Historical Society founder Jeremy Belknap stated in 1795, Black children were, quote, given away like puppies. One of the many enslaved people at First Church separated from their family was Sylvanus Worrow Sr., born in Maryland around 1645. The Worrows were enslaved by Daniel Gookin, who lived in Virginia and Maryland before removing to Massachusetts, where for 3 years he lived in Roxbury. Worrow Sr. and his brother Daniel were forced to New England without their parents. Worrow Sr. was a rebellious person who found himself in court on multiple occasions throughout his life. Perhaps his constant resistance is why, in 1667, Gookin hired him out to First Church of Roxbury member William Park for 8 years with a promise of freedom after the term expired. The promise of freedom at some future date was a strategy enslavers occasionally employed to convince rebellious slaves to comply with their wishes. In 1672, Worrow Sr. had an affair with one of William Park's white servants, First Church of Roxbury parishioner Elizabeth Parker, and was ordered to pay child support of 2 shillings 6 pence per week for the baby they conceived out of wedlock. Should he fail to do so, the court decreed he would be sold. But Worrow was not provided an opportunity to earn any money. Thus, the new father would be sold back into slavery, his contract for future freedom negated. Gookin not only harbored no qualms about Worrow's re-enslavement, but also offered to sell Worrow to Virginia away from the life he had built in Massachusetts. Park, however, found a local buyer, one Jonathan Wade of Medford. Elizabeth Parker, Worrow Sr.'s partner, was removed from Park's household after giving birth and sent to live with her father, Edmund, in Lancaster. Parker did not consider her relationship with Worrow shameful because he was Black. Indeed, she named her son Sylvanus Worrow Jr. after his father, shining an even brighter light on her former partner's and son's racial identities. Edmund, for his part, welcomed his multiracial grandson into his home and even successfully fought William Park and multiple county courts after they tried for economic gain to remove his grandchild from his home and bind him out to service. In 1709, Sylvanus Jr., the child, learned that he had a half-sister enslaved by Jonathan Wade, the product of a relationship between his father and another white woman, and was determined, as he said, quote, to get her free. Sylvanus Jr.'s half-sister, whose name remains unknown, should never have been enslaved because by law she took the status of her mother. She was free. Still, in a place and time when nearly all whites had no misgivings about racial chattel slavery, Sylvanus Jr. was unable to free his half-sister. The names highlighted behind me in red, they are native war captives at the First Church of Roxbury, and I'm going to speak a little bit about them. On July 30th, 1640, in the Court of Assistance, quote, 2 Indian women were adjudged to be whipped for their insolent behavior and for abusing Mrs. Weld, wife of First Church pastor Thomas Weld. One of these women may have been Nan, enslaved by Pastor Weld during the Pequot War of 1636 to 38. Presumably, the other native woman was also taken captive in the war, and at the time of her so-called insolent behavior, was likely enslaved by Pastor Weld or another First Church congregant. While First Church recorded Nan's death in its records, she was not a member. Neither was Esben, another white Pequot war captive enslaved by an unspecified First Church parishioner who died the day after Nan. This is all we know about them, their death. That's at least what the church recorded about them. Even if they wished to be members of the church, however, the congregation would probably refuse them. First Church neither baptized nor admitted into membership any Indigenous person in the colonial period. British colonists, however, began enslaving Indigenous people long before the Pequot War. In fact, the English enslaved Indians from coastal settlements in the early 17th century, well before they established any colonies in the region. The war did, however, intensify English slaving considerably. As Margaret Earl has written, although the Pequot War began for a variety of economic reasons, for the English and their Native American allies, it quickly became a conflict whose purpose was securing captives. The English in New England made a conscious decision to enslave Pequots. No First Church member and few English overall protested the mass enslavement of the Pequot. The only New Englanders who protested Pequot enslavements were Indigenous people themselves, even English allied Indians who were disgusted at the colonists' savagery. Despite these protests, the English enslaved hundreds of Pequot, many of whom they sold overseas. Several captives were sold into slavery in Bermuda in return for a number of goods, including other human beings, some of whom became the first enslaved Africans in New England. The first Bible printed in North America wasn't printed in English or any other European language, but in Algonquin in 1663. Many historians have previously claimed that First Church of Roxbury missionary John Eliot achieved this feat alone. But as Eliot himself noted, he was reliant upon Indigenous translators, interpreters, and teachers to produce the Algonquin Bible and the rest of his so-called Indian library. Early in his translation efforts, Eliot wrote Edward Winslow of Plymouth, quote, "I have yet but little skill in their language. I must have some Indians about me to try and examine translations." Cockanoe, a Montaukett from Long Island, was central to Eliot's translations. He was about 13 years old when enslaved by the English during the Pequot War while visiting his Pequot relatives. Cockanoe, whose name signified teacher or one with knowledge, swiftly obtained a strong grasp of English and local Wampanoag, Massachusetts dialects. Richard Callicott, a leader of the English forces, enslaved him for 11 years, and for some of that time, Cockanoe served as Eliot's teacher, translator, and interpreter. Eliot was impressed by Cockanoe. Quote, "This Indian is ingenious, can read, and I taught him to write, which he quickly learned. He was the first that I made use of to teach me words and to be my interpreter." Eliot hoped Cockanoe would become the first Indigenous member of his enslavers' church in Dorchester and use his command of multiple languages to advance the gospel. But Cockanoe had other plans, leaving Eliot utterly disappointed. The accomplished teacher chose to return to a leadership position in Indigenous communities. He enjoyed a 40-year career as an interpreter and advisor for Native and English clients in Long Island and Connecticut. Eliot then looked to John Sassamon, a Native servant, for assistance. During the Pequot War, Sassamon served as an interpreter and fought for the English. He was a servant in the household of Richard Callicott, who enslaved Cockanoe. Sassamon studied at Harvard for a few months in 1653, alongside students such as Increase Mather, and later served as a scribe and interpreter for multiple sachems, including Metacom or King Philip, until their relationship soured. In 1675, Sassamon was killed. The English accused 3 of Metacom's men of murder and on flimsy evidence had them tried, convicted, and hanged. Shortly thereafter began King Philip's War, in which at least 3 Indigenous people were taken captive and enslaved by members of the First Church of Roxbury. The church recorded them simply as, quote, "an Indian boy of Holbrook's, an Indian girl of Mr. Dudley, and a man named Peter." Other Indians vital to the translation project of First Church in Roxbury missionary John Eliot included Job Nesutan, who Eliot's associate Daniel Gookin described as, quote, a very good linguist in the English tongue, and was Mr. Eliot's assistant and interpreter in his translations of the Bible and other books of the Indian language. There was Wawas, recruited by Eliot to be a printer and thereafter known as James Printer. Printer was one of the only people in New England to be familiar with both the Algonquin language and its printing in English type. Eliot himself observed in 1683 that, quote, we have but one man, namely the Indian printer, that is able to compose these sheets and correct the press with understanding. To borrow Lisa Brooks's words, scholars like Cockenoe, Sassamon, Job Nesutan, and Wawas were not merely students who received or were subjected to a colonial education, but significant contributors to the emergence of a multilingual American literary tradition, beginning with the indigenous language publications of the Harvard Press, which was housed at the Indian College at Harvard University. Until their life histories are fully told and embedded into larger narratives of colonial New England, our understanding of the past and present will not only be incomplete, but crucially flawed. Thank you.
How do we actively today remember, and how do we integrate this history of enslaved human beings that we've been hearing about? How do we integrate their history into the present now?
Thank you very much. And Aabid, thank you again. And I have lots of questions for you too. So there's no simple, nice way to answer that question. So I won't even try, right? Stop lying. Start off by stop lying. Start off by assuming that if you learned anything in your life about any nice thing that white people did, question it. Start off there. See, get your mind set to make sure that you understand all the other people who were around all of them. There are no white people that came to America and only knew white people. None. I'd give them a monument. So you have to start with just assuming that you were wrong and that you're on a journey to find out the truth. I can give lots of examples of that. I think we saw a lot in Aabid's work. Part of it is that you got to understand there was years ago at the beginning of the civil rights movement and some of the first talk about Black history. There was a documentary about Black history on, I can't remember the major station, and it was called Black History Lost, Stolen, or Strayed. Right? And you have to assume that when you begin this work. You have to assume that there is just history that was purposely stolen. You have to assume, though, that there was history that was strayed. If you're an archivist, right, the first place to start is to throw away your index and redo it. Right? What is fascinating about the plans for this church building, the 1804 final version of the 5 buildings that are on this site, that the plans for the building, right, have always sat in a library at Harvard Divinity School, always. That's always there, right? But no one felt that that most scholars didn't believe that there were enough Black people around in Roxbury it would make any sense to go look for something like that, about how the seating patterns were laid out by the congregation at that time. And what's remarkable about it is we have lots of churches that describe their slave galleries. But here you had a church built after the end of legal slavery in Massachusetts. And when they built the church, Black people were such a part of that congregation that they had to label how the church layout would be segregated. It doesn't say slaves, it says colored, and it says colored on purpose because they knew they were designing a space for Black people who had only been legally enfranchised for approximately 10 years when this building went up. So that's where you start, and then go do it. And tell the truth, and then talk about everything you learned. Talk about all of it. Because that's the other interesting thing about the study of Black people by white people in this country, that those who know it, who have studied it, learn about it, refuse to publish it. Black historians had to set up a journal in the 1920s, a scholarly journal in the 1920s, because the American Association of Historians would not let Black people be published in their journal. And I think that that's the beginning. So try to connect any of those things with who you are, who your ancestors were, and what communities you live in. I was at, yeah, you have another question. Take the next question.
Yes.
So what I spent, as some of you know, in my youth, I used to run a museum. I ran the Museum of Afro-American History before I went into the legislature. And when I started there, I went to some people and asked them about how can I learn about this stuff, running a museum, but I don't have any time. We just bought the meeting house. We have to get going. I don't have any time to sit around. And I got this great advice, which is spend the summer at Williamsburg. So I spend the summer at Williamsburg, and I'm only, you're there for a week, and you realize, oh my God, where are all the Black people who were being the historic reenactors of the slaves who were here. And so I complained at one point to the head of Williamsburg, and started mentioning things. And he said, oh, Byron. Or yeah, he probably said that. He said, oh, Byron, we know all that stuff. We've published a book about it in the 1940s. Except we made no change in our programming based on what we knew. It's a great book. you can get it on eBay. It's a Negro in Colonial Williamsburg. Yes.
In many of the advertisements for people who are enslaved for being sold, it uses the word likely, a likely boy, a likely woman. What does that word likely mean in modern English? Summarize the question.
Yep. So the question is, in many slave advertisements, the word likely is used to describe the enslaved person. And what does that word mean? Effectively, likely means an enslaved person in good health that can work well. The point is that they are very profitable, and describing them that way, if they are that way, they will fetch a high price for the enslaver.
If you haven't read many, it's a great place to start. One historian has described slave ads as the only time that masters, that the enslavers were ever honest. It's the only time they told you the truth. He stole 5 of my suits. So the question is, what do you do with this information when you get it? And I think what you do with this information is what you do with all kinds of information, and that as you engage it, you engage other people and you fight about it. You have huge arguments about what it means, but you can't talk about what it means if you don't believe they existed, right? Or that it was fun, right? Which is a major myth in half the nation. I mean, white Southerners never said anything negative about slavery, probably until the 1960s, and you just couldn't find it. And so I would get the arguments with Southern students at Harvard all the time. They had a million myths, right? And I think you learn it and you engage it, and as you engage it, you'll learn more about it. What do you do about it? So the question is, what would you do about it if it was happening right now? I would be the first question I'd ask. What would you do about it if it was happening right now? There's a great novel called The Underground Airline. Has anyone seen The Underground Airline? It brings slavery up to the present. And so you don't need an underground railroad because no one knows what a railroad is. If you going to have people escape, you have to figure out other ways of doing that. And they call it the Underground Airline, right? Because in that novel, the Civil War does not end with a defeat, it ends with a compromise. It ends with a treaty between the South and the North, which almost happened. And so some states get to stay slave states into the 1970s. Right? Now, what would you do? Right? And I suspect that on one level, it would be a different kind of anger, right? That we would talk about slavery in a way that we talk about contemporary violence, right? But we never talk about slavery as we talk about contemporary violence. Yeah.
So I can use the mic.
That'd be great.
Very, very brief, thanks. Dave Harrington from Theodore Parker Church. First, thank you to everybody for the presentation. It was wonderful. So one could argue, Byron, that the folks that have been identified are as much a part of the New England aristocracy as the people we think of today as part of the New England aristocracy because of what they did and what they were through. How much is known about modern day descendants of this group, or am I getting ahead of?
No, you're getting right where you're right where that was our next talk. So we'll give you and that is that what do you do about this? And as I said, study it, but I might have been too flippant. There are groups of people who now are doing this seriously. So just like Shirley Eustace House and First Church, there's serious local history going on right now in the United States about slavery in those geographies that existed in those geographies, and trying to gain as much information about that as possible in order to go to one of the places you mentioned to tell the stories of them as individuals and not as statistics, right? And in order to do that, you have to get their names, somehow get their names. And so the list that people are putting together right now is just a key piece of work that almost anybody is qualified to get involved in, getting the list, going to all the churches and getting the list, right? So we have several churches that originated in the colony that still exist, and we have at least 4 of them in downtown Boston, which was then Boston, right? That have begun to engage in that work. And that's, of course, Old North, Old South, and King's Chapel. And I think if we can twist a few more arms, we'll probably get Trinity in this, which also existed before the revolution. We have an advantage in Boston in that is we have we have an advantage in Roxbury in that we have a more defined geography. So so you can look at the boundaries of Roxbury because they were separate from Boston until 1868. You can look at the boundaries, get the names of all of the pre-revolutionary institutions that either still exist or are archived here, and start working on those lists. And then after you start working on those lists, then you get to the hard part. And the hard part, of course, is to tell the stories of those individuals and the relationship that those individuals had with other Black individuals. What was it like? And so what was it like both as being enslaved, but also what was it like when you were first and became emancipated? What was that life like? And that, I think, will draw us, as some of us are hoping, closer and closer to the kind of genealogy that is hard work, but really necessary to connect as many of those people, to generations of those in those families that might have survived, that are still alive today. So this is a question about whether First Church itself, as a church, ever owned human beings, enslaved human beings, and then what the relationship to enslavement of leaders of the congregation, like ministers, was. I mean, they're famous ones. The enslaved man who Cotton Mather taught Cotton Mather vaccination, right? His congregation had given him to Cotton Mather, Onesimus, yeah.
So going off what Byron said, as far as the records show, none of the people mentioned in this report, none of the enslaved people were owned by the church itself, but the church obviously benefited from the economically and otherwise from the enslaved people that economically and otherwise benefited the lives of their enslavers and helped build the country and the town of Boston. But you're right, and as Byron said, it was a common practice for reverends and ministers to have enslaved people, and or to give, as you mentioned, to give the congregation giving the minister a human being as a gift.
So one example I can give of an institution that is engaged in doing this work and trying to connect with descendants is Virginia Theological Seminary, which was the second Episcopal seminary in the country. And they, after they were finally admitted that they had enslaved people working there, they have now decided that they should, this is not reparations. They should have a program of restitution. They should pay people's back wages, no play, because of course they knew what they were. And they, of course, had two groups of people. They had the people after the Civil War who got paid nothing, right? Vague, almost nothing, right? In the South, like most Black menial workers in the South. And so they're engaged in this work, which is very interesting. And they have genealogists tracing these people down. And you know, and they have gotten to the point where you have families who say, you know, too late. I don't want it, right? To families who are all white, which is an interesting thing, right? And I think that so institutions can engage in this, and there's some that are trying to figure out reasonable ways to do it, right? Reparations is reparations. Right? There's only one person who owes us the money in reparations, and that's the United States government. That's it, period. Right? And they're the only people who have enough money to give it. Right? But there are a million things in between. Right? As Stokely Carmichael would always say, when we had to talk to a group of white middle-class people who would ask the same question in another way, who would ask the same question in another way, you know. So I live in the suburbs. What do I do for Black people, right? And Stokely would always say, pay your maid a living wage. How should we be talking to families whose ancestors were enslavers? And in Boston, in Roxbury, it's easy to get the list started because we have all the streets are named after them. And so you had Thomas Seaver up there early on. So, you know, let's go to their kids and ask them.
I thought the Stevens were on the list.
Abolition is a funny thing. Now, there's another talk. Two things happened. We had several families where different members in the family were abolitionists and others were enslavers, and they never took on each other. So you can find lots of examples about that. But I think that the fact that there are family members who are abolitionists doesn't mean that there was no one in the family who supported slavery. We weren't, you know, there wasn't a bunch. Most of the Yankees, most of the white people in New England who engaged in slavery ran the trade, right? It was just incidental that they had some Black people living in their homes, right? So they made their money off of Black people they never saw. Yeah.
Your research obviously went in great depth with a lot of case histories and people. In your research on 17th century, 18th century, did you also run into any people categorized as colored who were not African, but East Asia, South Asia, elsewhere?
Oh,
As
you
part
mean
of-
who are not African?
Yes, that's a question. And secondly, I understand that the English, the Pilgrims also exploited indentured servants who were mostly white. Did you run into many of those cases? Now, my understanding is none of them were enslaved, but they were exploited.
So for this particular project, your first question, there weren't, the people of color I encountered were indigenous or African. But there were a few, there were a small number during this time of what they called East Indians in the 13 colonies. It obviously because, and you can see, like, I think in John Adams' records, for example, I was looking the other day, and there, he mentions that there's an East Indian slave. It's not clear. Some people assume they're referring to Madagascar, but I haven't found any definitive evidence of that. So like that's one example where, you have an East, an Indian or Asian in the United States. And yeah, there were a lot of indentured servants. A lot of them were white. So one of them I mentioned, I believe it was Elizabeth Parker. So that is very true, and a lot of people were exploited. I think the difference, of course, is that they weren't property, and they weren't property, and they couldn't as easily or didn't have to live with the dread, the everlasting dread of being torn from their families. But yes, people profited off of all types of workers and human property which they enslaved.
Two parts of the question. The people who came from Lincolnshire in 1630, what was their experience with slavery? Was there slavery in England? Would they have known about that? And the second part of the question is, how soon after they arrived here did they start enslaving themselves?
The easy answer is the English knew all about slavery before they ever decided to be imperialist here after Ireland, right? And of course, a lot of people think they enslaved the Irish at certain times, but they would know about it. I just learned this I was just doing a thing on what indigenous people ate for what we call Thanksgiving, and came across this wonderful comment that King Henry liked turkeys. So that means that before the English came to the United States, turkeys were being exported to the Europe from Mexico, right? And became a favorite dish of the very rich. Yeah. So there was a lot of knowledge about what's going on in both places.
The audience at 6, Aabid, do you have some more to add to that?
Just a little bit, which is England was relatively late to the game, as it were, but they in the 1630s. There have been African descended people there for hundreds of years. I'm not quite sure.
Yes, because of course England has the famous court case, and that was in the late 1790s, where England said you cannot be enslaved on English land. Didn't count the Caribbean, but right. Yeah, so obviously you don't have the court cases for things that don't exist, problems that don't arise. Yeah, yes, and certainly by 1790 there had been some slavery, African slavery in England.
Oh yeah, of course. By that date there was
that date. Yeah.
And when did they start enslaving here?
So the second part of the question is when did the colonists start enslaving people in New England? And the answer to that is almost right away. So the Pequot War effectively turns into a war for captives for many people. Massachusetts is founded in 1630. The Pequot War is 1636. But they started enslaving people and stealing indigenous people, from before they even established colonies here in Plymouth or Massachusetts, because in the early 17th century, the British were here, but they hadn't established formal colonies. They didn't have the charter.
So, and how do people access the report? That's been discussed a bunch in the chat. How do people get a hold of your great report?
If you go, I'm looking at Mary Margaret to shake her head as I If you go on this First Church's UUM website, there's a link to it. Is that correct?
I'll just say www.uuum.org.
Right. And unlike Trinity Copley, you only have to do one hit, you just have to hit it once to get to the report, right? Those who want to get the one that Trinity did, let me know. I'll help them.
So Abid, have you been able to contact any of the descendants of some of the enslaved people that we heard the names of here? So people are wondering. And also Byron in a moment and Abid, are there histories of the Black churches in Roxbury and or Boston that people can look at? And what were some of the denominations?
So to the first part of the question, that's as Byron Rushing said a few minutes ago, finding and researching who the descendants are, contacting them. That's the next step. And I understand that Byron Rushing and Reverend Earl have started a local history community in order to engage in that work. What was the second part of the question?
Black churches
Oh.
here in Roxbury and Boston.
Yes, and that history, I mean, it can be found in a lot of places, but I'll mention Dr. Richard Bowles because he gave a talk a few weeks ago for Historic Boston's.
Right. So Black Christians in Boston, we're not exactly sure when they were first became organized, but we know that happened before the revolution. And ironically, before they were able to move into Beacon Hill, the north slope of Beacon Hill, they looked for places where they could worship. There were white churches that allowed them to worship for a variety of reasons. They didn't find that acceptable. The Black people did not find that acceptable. And interesting, one of the first places they asked to be able to use was Faneuil Hall. And they used Faneuil Hall right around the time of the American Revolution to worship. But the city decided that the town decided that they should still go to church on Sunday. So they would only let them use the space and Faneuil Hall on weekdays. And then, of course, they started a Baptist church in the North Slope, and that's the African Meeting House, which we're lucky to have its building survive and is extant. And if there's anybody who has not been to the African Meeting House, they're going to take you out of the room now. Right?
Yeah, I know you're trying to wrap it up, Roxanne, with the last question, but I did want to acknowledge, it was mentioned that there's a history committee that has emerged to dig into the work of this report, and we're honored that several, I don't know if you would be willing to stand and be acknowledged, members of that history committee that are here with us tonight, or you can raise your hands or stand if you want, but we want to thank them for carrying this work forward.
And let me ask a wrap-up question to our presenters, which is, what do you think is the most important takeaway that people should take away from this research and from the thinking that and discussion we've started tonight or continued tonight, because this is by no means the start of a conversation?
So for me, it is to connect with people who are doing the work. And depending on their, like we learn every day of people doing this work and never knew about us. So, but there are organizations in some of the suburbs. There is Hidden Brookline, and then the Jamaica Plain neighborhood has just started some significant research on slavery in Jamaica Plain. even though I have to keep telling him Jamaica Plain is really Roxbury, but that's okay. I'll take. And they're called Hidden JP. Yeah, right. And there's several churches that are doing this work. Yeah, right. But so one of the things is to gather some people together that to do this work. I'm a big fan of doing it geographically, but it doesn't have to be. You can do it by inside the history of institutions also.
For me, it's, in Roxbury and the area around here, there have been, several groups, local historians, public historians, and individuals who've lived here their whole life who've done this kind of work and much more work in terms of activism and community organizing for a long time. Mr. Plant is one of those people. He's a wealth of knowledge about all things First Church in Roxbury, for instance. So if it's, I just hope the report is somewhat useful to folks like Mr. Plant who've been doing this work for a long time, and whatever is useful is important to me.
And before we sit down, Aabid and I are really in a lot of trouble. We forgot to mention the Royal House, right? And the Royal House in Medford has the only extant building for the housing of enslaved people, probably in New England. Is that true? Yeah, in New England. And so this is not enslaved people living sort of anywhere they can find. But this was an estate that was developed by Royal when he decided to move from Antigua, if I get this straight, to Boston and buy land and build a mansion house, and brought his enslaved people with him. My guess is he was selective. I think he brought all his carpenters and masons who were enslaved with him, because they did a pretty good job of building those buildings. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'd like all of us to give a huge hand of thanks to Aabid Allibhai, Byron Rushing, and Mary Margaret Earl, and the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministries. This wraps up the 6th and final presentation for the fall series of the Partnership of Historic Bostons. All of our series has been recorded, and much of it is already up on our website. This will be going up in a few days or so once we edit it. The website is Historic Bostons, plural, Bostons with an S, .org. And I want to thank Mass Humanities for the generous grant that they gave us so that we could both practice and do hybrid Zoom and in-person events, which is tricky, as our Zoom audience has especially experienced. Want to very much thank the UU Urban Ministries and Roxbury Historical Society and the Great History Committee, many of whom members are here in the audience live. And let me tell you briefly what Partnership of Historic Bostons will be doing next, which is on January 17th at 7 in the evening. We'll be doing another Zoom-only presentation. Dror Goldberg, who is a historian, will be doing a presentation on New England Puritans and the invention of modern currency. I'm like, really? Cool. And Margaret Newell, who was mentioned by Aabid this evening, and who was one of our presenters earlier in this series, she will be coming back at a date we don't yet have, but she will be talking about her current research, which is Native Indigenous peoples escaping slavery with the help of other enslaved people. So that's coming up too. So with that, thank you so much for being part of the Partnership of Historic Boston's fall series on enslavement and resistance in New England, 1620 to 1760. And thank you so much for being part of this groundbreaking research, and let's all go forward with this.
I just want to interrupt you just for a second before we leave, and that is to say how impressed I am with the programs that Historic Boston's has been putting together and conducting. If there's anybody who doesn't know Historic Boston's, do go on their website and learn about their history. I always thought it was a social club of just people who lived in both cities. Right. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, everybody.